My name is Evelyn Brooks, and for 24 years, I believed that if you gave a company everything, your time, your sleep, your family moments, your intelligence, they would at least understand your value. I believed that systems protecting pilots' lives mattered more than boardroom trends. I believed experience still carried weight. Then, one cold Monday morning, they pushed me out of a conference room like obsolete equipment and handed my career to a CEO's grandson who spoke about AI innovation like he'd invented the future himself. They thought I walked away defeated. What they didn't understand was that the termination papers they made me sign activated a patent clause capable of freezing their entire defense operation. I sat in the glass conference room at Orion Dynamics while white ceiling lights reflected off the polished table between us. Across from me sat CEO Victor Langley, calm enough to make it seem like he was discussing quarterly adjustments instead of erasing 24 years of my life. I'm 47 years old, aerospace defense engineer, the woman they called when targeting systems drifted too close to failure, or when safety architecture started behaving unpredictably under combat stress. I was used to pressure. I was used to classified reviews, sleepless nights, emergency calls at 3 a.m, and the understanding that one overlooked error could decide whether a pilot returned home alive. But I wasn't prepared for how simple betrayal would look. Victor slid the termination papers toward me and said the company needed modern leadership, new energy, and future-focused innovation. I heard every word, and inside me, something became very still, because I understood something he didn't. You cannot build a future by tearing out the foundation holding it up. The person replacing me was his grandson, Ryan Langley. 25 years old, business school polished, expensive suit, always holding a phone like it was an extra limb. Ryan loved talking about AI optimization, predictive automation, machine learning integration. In meetings, he spoke with the confidence of someone who had never watched a real system fail in real time. Board members loved him. People who cared more about growth charts than safety protocols always loved men like that. But I had spent years taking apart damaged guidance systems after dangerous failures. I'd spent nights tracking faults through layers of code while pilots waited for answers. Ryan had never sat with the knowledge that a mistake could kill someone. Yet Victor looked at him like he was the future, and looked at me like I was an inconvenience, standing in its way. What hurt wasn't losing the title. It was realizing how casually they dismissed sacrifice. A week earlier, I'd missed my son Mason's commissioning ceremony at the Air Force Academy. My dress uniform had already been hanging in the closet. My flight confirmation sat in my inbox. I had imagined watching him walk across that stage. Then the emergency call came. Critical navigation instability in a fighter program. If we didn't isolate the fault immediately, targeting systems could become unreliable in field conditions. So I stayed, not for Victor, not for Orion Dynamics, not even for the paycheck. I stayed because somewhere out there, pilots would trust that system with their lives. Maybe one day Mason would too. I worked for 3 days straight, drinking cold coffee and writing notes across technical reports until the fault was isolated and corrected. When Mason called after the ceremony, he tried to hide his disappointment, but a mother hears those things anyway. So when Victor told me my time had passed, I didn't just hear termination. I heard every missed birthday dinner, every cancelled holiday, every moment I traded away believing loyalty mattered. If you've ever sacrificed everything for a place that treated your dedication like it was automatic, then you already understand the silence I felt When I picked up the pen and signed those papers, Victor thought I was too stunned to resist. Ryan probably thought women from my generation were simply used to stepping aside quietly. But my silence wasn't surrender, it was restraint. Because years earlier, when Orion Dynamics was still a small Huntsville contractor struggling to survive, the original founder, Leonard Langley, had worked closely with me on patent licensing structures. Leonard understood something his son never learned. Defense technology is not software for trendy presentations. It is responsibility. He insisted that every major licensing agreement include a protection clause. If an original design engineer was terminated without cause, operational rights connected to their systems would automatically revert to that engineer. At the time, I thought the clause was excessive. Leonard didn't. He understood how easily arrogant leadership could destroy things they didn't build. When I signed my termination papers, that clause activated instantly, and Victor Langley never even realized. The patent portfolio tied to my systems included 41 defense patents, guidance architecture, authentication layers, carrier landing backup systems, missile safety protocols, nearly $1 billion in infrastructure. But the real value wasn't financial. Every patent represented nights I didn't go home, vacations cancelled, emergency calls answered, while Mason was still small enough to ask why his mother always had to leave dinner. Those systems weren't decorative technology. They were designed around one question: if everything goes wrong, what keeps people alive? That's why every operational system required periodic authorization checks connected to the original design engineer. Not because I wanted control, because years earlier, after a reverse engineering threat from a foreign competitor, I learned that military systems should never trust authority permanently. Authority had to be verified continuously. While I worked at Orion, the process stayed invisible. The moment they fired me without cause, invisible became impossible to ignore. The next morning, I woke automatically at 5:30. For a few seconds, I reached for my phone expecting alerts and emergency updates. Instead, the house stayed quiet. I made coffee, sat near the kitchen window. Then my phone vibrated. First message: operational authorization denied. Second message: licensing verification failed. Third message: original design engineer, authentication required. Then, dozens more followed. Defense contractors, program managers, emergency contacts. Every system was asking for the same thing. Me. I could practically picture Victor storming through the executive floor, demanding explanations, while Ryan searched for some emergency override he assumed existed. But my systems weren't built to obey executives. They obeyed legal authority, and legally, that authority belonged to me now. Calls started flooding in from engineering heads, contractors, defense officials. I let them all go to voicemail. Not because I enjoyed the panic, because if I answered too quickly, this would become a technical inconvenience instead of what it truly was, a leadership failure. By midday, defense media had picked up the story. At first they called it a temporary authentication disruption during organizational transition. Industry engineers understood immediately what that really meant. Forums exploded. People started saying this was what happened when companies replaced expertise with presentation skills. Ryan made things worse. In the middle of the crisis, he posted online about revolutionary AI integration and future-forward transformation. The comments turned brutal within minutes. Engineers posted screenshots of system failures. Pilots questioned leadership competency. Defense analysts mocked every corporate buzzword he used. By afternoon, the post disappeared. I didn't enjoy watching him drown publicly. I believe young people deserve opportunity, but opportunity is not entitlement, and confidence is not competence. That afternoon, Mason called from the academy. His voice carried something I hadn't heard before. Anger. He asked how they could fire me after everything I built. I looked out at the backyard grass I'd neglected for weeks, because work always came first. Then, I told him something I wish I'd understood earlier in life. Sometimes being pushed out of a place that no longer values you is the only thing that forces you to see your own worth clearly. He asked if I could restore everything if I wanted. Yes, I told him. But I won't rescue people who treated my life's work like it was disposable. That answer hurt to say, because innocent employees would suffer too. But boundaries matter, and kindness without boundaries becomes permission. Over the next 24 hours, the crisis escalated. Targeting systems shifted into safe shutdown. Missile guidance platforms froze authorization access. Defense partners suspended contracts until operational authority could be clarified. But the systems never became dangerous. That mattered to me. Even after everything, my work still followed its first principle. Protect lives before profits. The safety architecture locks systems down safely instead of allowing unstable operation. That difference separated engineering from recklessness. Then Ryan held a press conference. I watched it alone from a diner booth, with cold tea sitting untouched beside me. He stood behind the podium, reading prepared statements about temporary integration issues and minor operational disruptions. No real engineer would ever call military system shutdowns minor disruptions. Then a reporter asked whether patent authority still rested with former engineer Evelyn Brooks. That was the moment Ryan cracked. He called my systems outdated legacy, infrastructure, built on old analog thinking. Said Orion was moving toward AI-driven modernization that wouldn't rely on previous generation engineering. Something cold rose inside my chest. Because he wasn't insulting me anymore. He was insulting every pilot who trusted those systems, and the industry reacted immediately. Former military officers spoke publicly. Aerospace engineers defended my work. Pilots shared stories about backup protocols that had saved missions when primary systems failed. One fighter pilot described surviving a sandstorm navigation collapse because of an emergency architecture I designed years earlier. I read every statement slowly. For years, I'd hidden behind technical language, protocols, tolerances, authentication layers, because thinking too much about the human side made the responsibility unbearable. But suddenly people were saying the quiet part aloud. My work brought people home alive. The next morning, Victor finally called me himself. His voice sounded nothing like it had inside the conference room. No confidence, no authority, only panic. He said the situation had spiraled out of control. I told him this wasn't chaos, it was consequence. He offered my position back immediately, then more money, then equity, then executive control. Finally, he asked me to name my price. I sat silently at my kitchen table, watching steam rise from my coffee, and realized something strange. He genuinely believed everything could still be purchased back. Then, he reminded me that over 1,000 employees depended on Orion Dynamics, families, mortgages, medical bills, and that hurt, because he was right. But it made me angrier too. Victor remembered those employees only after his own chair became unstable. Not when he fired the engineer protecting the systems holding the company together. Not when he handed critical infrastructure to a grandson obsessed with image over understanding. I told him trust cannot be repurchased. once arrogance destroys it. Then he asked what I wanted, and the truth frightened him. I want nothing from you. Silence followed, because when someone still wants money, negotiation remains possible. But when they no longer need anything from you, power disappears. The board forced Victor to resign before market close. Ryan was quietly reassigned to special projects, which in corporate language means hidden until public embarrassment fades. Orion stock collapsed. Financial networks spent days discussing nepotism in defense, contracting, and the dangers of replacing expertise with buzzwords. An aerospace journal called The Situation a textbook example of confidence being mistaken for competence. I didn't feel victorious watching the collapse. Companies don't fall alone. Innocent people fall with them. But I didn't feel guilty either. I hadn't destroyed Orion Dynamics. I had simply stopped carrying people who believed they no longer needed me. A few days later, Mason called again. This time his voice sounded different, quieter. He said he'd been reading comments from pilots and officers talking about my systems. Then he said something that nearly broke me. I never knew your work mattered like that. For years, I'd hidden behind, I'm busy, instead of explaining why I disappeared during emergencies, or came home exhausted and emotionally distant. I thought protecting him meant separating him from the weight of my work. Instead, it only made him think I'd chosen career over family. Now he finally understood, and for the first time in years, I felt him seeing me clearly. 3 days later, a Washington number appeared on my phone. The woman introduced herself as Director Helena Ward from the Department of Defense. She said they had been closely monitoring the Orion situation. But what impressed them most wasn't the collapse. It was the way my systems responded when authority was violated. No dangerous failures. No uncontrolled breakdowns. Only structured shutdown, authentication protection, and operational containment. That, she told me, is the kind of engineering philosophy we want shaping future defense standards. Then she offered me a position as Chief Technology Advisor for Defense Innovation, International Coordination, Allied Defense Standards, direct oversight on next-generation aerospace safety architecture. Double my previous salary. Real authority. Real respect. And a team that understood innovation without experience is just risk wearing expensive clothes. Accepted that afternoon, not to prove something to Victor or Ryan, but because for the first time in years, I was being invited into a place that actually understood the value of what I carried. 6 months later, I sat in my Washington office, overlooking the city while Mason walked slowly around the room, studying framed citations and medals I'd never shown him before. He stopped in front of a Navy commendation and held it carefully. Then he looked at me and apologized. I told him he had nothing to apologize for, but he shook his head. For years I thought work mattered more to you than family, he said quietly. Now I understand you were protecting people. That sentence meant more than every award I'd ever received. Then he told me he was considering aerospace engineering himself. Not because he felt obligated, because now he understood where those footsteps led. And in that moment, I realized something important. I hadn't only recovered my career, I'd recovered part of my son. Orion Dynamics was eventually sold for a fraction of its former value. Ironically, the acquiring company later hired me as a consultant to help rebuild the defense relationships Victor and Ryan destroyed. I accepted under one condition. Safety and professional authority would always matter more than management slogans. Victor retired quietly, Ryan disappeared from public innovation circles entirely. Don't hate either of them, but I no longer shrink myself to soften the consequences of their arrogance, because the best revenge is not destroying the people who underestimated you. The best revenge is building a life so far beyond their reach that eventually their approval stops mattering at all, and maybe that's the real lesson. Experience is not obsolete. In industries where lives depend on decisions, experience is often the final wall, standing between people and disaster.